Hey everybody. So far we've talked about functions and we've done it mostly using the equation. So we're doing it algebraically. But what if we're given a graph of an equation? We want to be able to tell whether what we're looking at is a function or not. And so we have something called the vertical line test. And the vertical line test says that if no vertical line intersects the graph of a curve or just points, a scatter plot, at more than one point, then the curve or scatter plot is a function. And this makes sense. If I draw a vertical line down, if I'm hitting more than one point, that means for the same input, let's say the input was 0, I'm getting two outputs, okay? And that is exactly the not the definition of a function. That's the thing that we're looking out for. We don't want to get two different outputs for the same input. And that's what a vertical line test will tell us, is if we are getting that. So if we fail the vertical line test, then we don't have a function. If we pass the vertical line test, then what we're looking at is a function. So starting with this graph here, okay? Now again, I'm going to imagine having a some sort of vertical line. I wonder if I can I move that once I don't know. So I'm going to imagine having a vertical line, and then I want to take that vertical line nope, that's not what I wanted. I'm going to take that vertical line and I want to move it across. There we go. So I can move it across okay. So I can take this vertical line and no, I can't really move it across. Okay. Doing the best I can. So I'm going to take this vertical line and I want to move it across my graph. And as I move it across my graph, is it intersecting more than one point at a time as I go across? Now, to me, it is not. Okay, I'm hitting one point in every location. So like I'm hitting this one point here, and that's the only point I'm hitting. And then when the vertical line comes over here, I'm hitting this one point right here. Okay? And so I'm never hitting more than one point at a time. And so this is a function. It passes the vertical line test. Okay? So yes, it passes the vertical line test. So it's a function. Looking at this one, okay? Actually, let's take a minute before we move on. Let's talk about the domain and range of this. So the domain would be all the values that this graph takes on horizontally. And the way I like to think about it is if I had a light, so let's say I had a light shining from above here. Okay, we have a light shining. What's the shadow that this graph would cast onto the x-axis? What kind of shadow would I be looking at along the x-axis? And in this case, it looks like this graph, even though it looks like even though this graph looks pretty narrow, this is still not just moving up, but it's moving out. It's moving out horizontally this way. And it's not going out as quickly as it's going up, but eventually it goes out in both directions forever. And so the domain here would be all real numbers. Now when we talk about the range, we want to think about now, instead of the light being up here, we want to think about the light being over here, shining a light. And where would there be a shadow on the y-axis? Well, it looks like the light can get through up here, right? Just fine. So there's no shadow on the y-axis. But here, it looks like the light is being blocked by the graph. And so there's a shadow starting at 0 and going up from there. And so the range for this function would be starting at 0, including 0. The shadow is at 0, and going all the way to infinity. So there's my domain and range. Let's look at the next one. So first, let's determine if this is a function. Does it pass the vertical line test? And again, if I drew a vertical line here, and then I dragged it around, it looks like it passes the vertical line test. Only hitting one point at a time. So there's the 1 point that I'm hitting right here. And as I go through, it's only hitting 1 point. So this is a function. So it does pass the vertical line test. The domain, now sometimes that light shining thing doesn't work as well, because if we think about the light shining from up here, you're like, well, that ray of light hits the x-axis, but this is still part of the domain, right? So it might even be better to think about if I took, if I was able to take my hand and put it up here and put it down here, my other hand down here, and then squish this graph, squash it against the x-axis, where would the guts be of the leftover graph once I've squashed it into the x-axis? And the answer is the guts would be from here to here, right? This is how much of the x-axis would be covered with graph guts, okay? And these would be filled in circles. So we'd have graph guts from -7 to 7. So the domain here is from -7, including -7, all the way to 7, including 7. The range, same idea. What if I squashed the graph, instead of from up and down, if I squashed it from the right and the left? Okay, so what if I took the graph and squashed it here, going this way against the y-axis? Where would the guts be then? Well, it looks like, and we always start from the bottom. So left to right is how we read the graph, but when we're reading it, thinking about the y values, we always read it from bottom to top, which is a little less intuitive because that's not how we read, okay? And so it looks like here that if we're starting with the smallest value, that smallest value is -3 all the way up until 7. So that is the range. So we have to think about, again, in the vertical direction, we always, when we do our interval notation, we're always starting with the smallest value. Now in the x direction, that is left to right, which is normally how we read. But in the y direction, it's from bottom to top, which is the opposite of how we read. So just a side note there. Okay. Looking at this one here, let's draw a vertical line. Okay, I'll draw a vertical line here, and you can see that this vertical line fails the vertical line test. I hit the graph twice. And so when a graph fails the vertical line test, it's very obvious looking. This looks very obvious here. So this is not a function. So this does not pass the vertical line test. And it only has to fail once to fail the function test. This one fails in a lot of places. This is not a function. It fails in a lot of places. It might pass right here, where it hits just that 1 point, but it fails everywhere else. And so this is not a function, and it only has to fail the one time. And if we wanted to talk about the domain and range, we could. It does look like this is going up forever, but I'm not really sure where this is going in terms of that. So I would probably estimate that the domain is from negative infinity to 6. And the range is from, I have to estimate this because it's hard to tell on the graph here. It looks like negative 6.3 to infinity. So I started at the bottom and went up. It looks like it hits everything vertically above that point on. But again, I don't know what this graph is doing. It could do something like this, and it could just be like it looks like an eggplant, and we could be done with it. So that is the vertical line test.